In the heart of Rome, there was a woman who was not allowed to bleed in front of others, not allowed to marry, not allowed to let a fire go out. And if she broke one sacred rule, Rome did not execute her. Rome did something far stranger. They buried her alive in a room built just for that purpose, with a single lamp, a little bread, and a little oil. Enough to survive for a few days. Enough to make her death last. Why would the most powerful civilization in the ancient world go to such extreme lengths to kill a woman without technically killing her? Why did they leave her food she could never truly use to escape? And why, centuries later, do historians still argue about how many of these women were actually guilty of anything at all? The answer takes us into one of the darkest corners of Roman religion, and it starts with a fire that was never allowed to go out. At the center of the Roman Forum stood a round temple unlike any other in the city. Inside it burned a flame that, according to Roman belief, had been kept alive since the founding of Rome itself. This was the fire of Vesta, goddess of the hearth, and Romans believed that as long as that flame burned, Rome itself would survive. Let it go out, even for a moment, and the city believed disaster was already on its way. The women who guarded it were called the Vestal virgins. They were chosen as young girls, sometimes as young as 6 years old, taken from their families, and bound to serve the goddess for 30 years. For 10 years they learned. For 10 years they served. For 10 years they trained the next generation. And through all 30 years, they had to remain untouched. A single lifetime, split into 3 long chapters, all built around one flame that could never be allowed to flicker out. But here is where it gets strange. These women were not powerless victims hidden away in a temple. They were some of the most privileged people in Rome. They could own property. They could write wills. They could pardon condemned criminals with a single word, simply by crossing their path on the way to execution. They rode in carriages through the city while ordinary Roman women walked. Even consuls were required to lower their symbols of power in a Vestal's presence. And yet, underneath all that power, one broken rule could end everything, instantly, without warning. So what exactly was that rule? And how strict was strict, really? A Vestal's greatest duty was not just tending the fire, it was protecting something else entirely, her body. Chastity was not treated as a personal virtue for these women. It was believed to be directly tied to the survival of Rome itself. Romans believed that if a Vestal broke her vow, the goddess Vesta would be insulted, and the protective power over the city would weaken, opening the door to disaster. This is where the fear starts to feel almost irrational, and yet Romans took it with total seriousness. If Rome suffered a plague, a military defeat, a famine, or any unexplainable disaster, one of the first places people looked for blame was the house of the Vestals. A failing fire, a strange omen in the sky, a whispered rumor passed between senators. Any of it could be enough to trigger an accusation that would end a woman's life. And once an accusation was made, there was no quiet resolution. There was a trial, overseen by the highest religious authority in Rome, the Pontifex Maximus himself. And if the Vestal was found guilty, Rome carried out a punishment so unusual that historians still argue over exactly why it was designed the way it was, instead of something far simpler. Roman law had a peculiar obsession. No one could be legally responsible for spilling a Vestal's blood. Not the executioner, not the priests, not even the state itself. Killing her directly, by sword or by strangulation, was considered a crime against the gods, one that could bring divine punishment down on whoever carried it out. So Rome invented something else entirely. A way to end her life without anyone actually striking the blow. and without a single drop of blood touching Roman soil. The condemned Vestal was placed on a covered litter, strapped down and bound so tightly that not even her cries could be heard by the crowds outside. She was carried through the city in complete silence, past people who came out just to watch her pass, past the temple she had served for years, to a place just inside the city walls called the Campus Sceleratus, the Field of Wickedness. Even the name of that place was chosen to leave no room for sympathy. There, underground, a small chamber had already been prepared in advance, waiting. Just big enough for a bed, a lit lamp, a loaf of bread, a little water, and a little oil. She was led down a ladder into the earth, and once she reached the bottom, the ladder was pulled up behind her. The entrance was sealed with soil and packed down until the ground looked undisturbed, as if nothing were beneath it at all. Within hours, that spot looked like any other patch of earth in the city. This detail is the part that unsettles people the most. If Rome intended for her to die, why leave her food, water, and oil for the lamp? Why give her any chance at survival, however small? The answer reveals just how carefully Romans tried to avoid direct guilt. By giving her a lamp, bread, and water, Rome could claim, at least symbolically, that she had a chance to live. That her death, if it came, was not their doing, but the will of the gods. It was a legal and religious loophole, allowing an entire city to condemn a woman to a slow death in the dark, while insisting collectively that they had not killed her at all. In their minds, they had simply given her the tools to survive. What happened after that was between her and the goddess she had betrayed. Of course, no one escaped. The chamber had no way out once the ladder was gone. The supplies delayed the inevitable by days at most, maybe a week if she rationed carefully. But that delay mattered enormously to a culture terrified of divine punishment for spilling sacred blood. A few extra days in the dark, alone, was apparently an acceptable price for a clean conscience. What makes this ritual even more chilling is what happened after the burial. There was no public execution date to mark, no monument, no name spoken aloud in ceremony afterward. The Vestal simply vanished from Roman life. Her name was often removed from official records. The exact location of her tomb was deliberately left unmarked in later memory, swallowed back into the ordinary ground of the city, walked over by people who had no idea what lay beneath their feet. Ancient writers tell us that crowds did gather to watch the procession to the Campus Sceleratus, but once the earth was packed down, that was the end of it. No trial transcripts read aloud in the market, no lingering scandal discussed for years afterward. Rome wanted the fire's honor restored quickly, and silence was part of how they achieved that. The faster the city forgot, the faster it could convince itself the danger had passed. Now, here is where the story becomes even more unsettling. History has left us a handful of named cases, and they reveal something troubling about how these accusations actually unfolded. One of the earliest stories comes from the founding myth of Rome itself. Rhea Silvia, a Vestal priestess, was said to have given birth to twin sons after claiming the war god Mars had fathered them. Depending on which ancient source you read, she was either thrown into a river or condemned to death for breaking her vow. Those twins were Romulus and Remus, the very founders of Rome, which means, according to Roman legend, the city itself was born from the same crime that its own laws were built to punish. Centuries later, in 114 and 113 BC, Rome was gripped by a scandal involving several Vestals at once. 3 women, Aemilia, Licinia, and Marcia, were accused together after a series of unsettling omens shook the city, including a lightning strike interpreted as a sign of divine anger. A first trial acquitted 2 of them, but public suspicion did not fade. A second trial was ordered, this time overseen by a specially appointed judge known for his harshness. All three women were eventually found guilty and executed in the traditional way, sealed beneath the campus sceleratus. Notice the pattern here. It was not new evidence that changed their fate. It was public pressure, fear, and a desire to find someone to blame. Then there is the story of Tuccia, a Vestal accused of breaking her vow, who reportedly proved her innocence in the strangest way imaginable. According to legend, she carried water from the Tiber River all the way to the temple using nothing but a sieve, and not a single drop fell through. The impossible feat was taken as proof that the goddess Vesta herself was protecting her, and Tuccia was spared. But ask yourself this: how many other Vestals never got the chance to perform an impossible miracle in their own defense? How many were sealed underground simply because no such legend existed to save them? This pattern reveals something troubling that historians who study these cases point out again and again. Several of the most famous Vestal trials happened during moments of political crisis, military disaster, or public panic, not necessarily when there was solid evidence of wrongdoing. When Rome lost battles it should have won, or suffered plagues no one could explain, suspicion turned toward the Vestals almost automatically, like a reflex the city could not control. A scapegoat with sacred significance was, in some twisted way, useful. Punishing a Vestal gave the illusion that Rome had identified the cause of its misfortune and corrected it. Whether she was actually guilty of anything at all may have mattered far less than Rome needed to believe it did. The confession, if there was one, could be extracted under pressure that would satisfy no modern standard of justice at all. It is worth pausing here to consider what life must have been like for these women, carrying both extraordinary privilege and extraordinary danger at the same time. A Vestal could speak with more legal freedom than almost any other woman in Rome. She could stop an execution just by walking past a condemned man on his way to death. And yet a rumor, a jealous rival, an unlucky season of bad omens, any of these could turn that same power into a death sentence with almost no room for defense. Imagine living 3 decades of your life knowing that a bad harvest or a lost battle hundreds of miles away could suddenly turn the entire city against you. This contradiction, reverence, and vulnerability bound together in the same breath is part of why the story of the Vestals still fascinates people today. It reveals just how far an ancient society was willing to go to protect a symbol it believed held its entire fate in balance. And it raises an uncomfortable question that historians still cannot fully answer. How many of the women sealed beneath the campus sceleratus were truly guilty of anything? And how many simply had the misfortune of being alive during a year when Rome needed someone to blame? To this day, historians are not entirely certain how many Vestals actually met this fate, since Roman records were selective about what they preserved and what they let fade into silence on purpose. What we do know comes from scattered ancient sources, fragments of Livy, Plutarch, and Pliny, and each mention leaves us with more questions than answers about how many chambers still lie sealed beneath the ground where the campus sceleratus once stood, somewhere near the Colline Gate on the edge of the ancient city. Rome built an empire on order, law, and the appearance of divine favor. But underneath that order was a punishment designed entirely around avoiding blame, a chamber cut into the earth, a lamp slowly burning down to nothing, and a silence that Rome made absolutely sure would never be broken. Somewhere beneath modern Rome, that silence may still be waiting.